If you've ever heard of the Gullah-Geechee people, you probably know the basic outline. Enslaved Africans brought to the rice plantations of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, cut off from the mainland on remote sea islands for generations. A people who somehow held on to more of their African heritage than almost any other black community in America. Sweetgrass baskets, a distinct Creole language, a spiritual connection to one specific country in West Africa, Sierra Leone. That story isn't false, but it's incomplete. When scientists sequenced the actual DNA of the Gullah-Geechee people, what they found was more complicated and more remarkable than the version most of us have been told. Let's start with the story almost everyone already knows. In 1756, a 10-year-old girl was loaded onto a slave ship called the Harriet, sailing out of a fortress called Bunce Island, 20 miles up a river in what is now Sierra Leone. Bunce Island was one of roughly 40 European slave trading castles along the West African coast, but it had a very specific specialty: rice. The Carolina and Georgia colonies were becoming obscenely wealthy off rice cultivation, which requires deep, generational technical knowledge, tidal flooding systems, irrigation, exact timing. So planters paid premium prices specifically for captives from West Africa's so-called rice coast, stretching from Senegal down through Sierra Leone, because those people already knew how to grow it. The wealth of colonial Charleston wasn't just built on stolen labor, it was built on stolen expertise. That 10-year-old girl survived a brutal 10-week crossing that killed 16 of the 84 people aboard. A planter named Elias Ball II bought her and renamed her Priscilla. She lived out her life enslaved on a rice plantation outside Charleston, married a man named Jeffrey, and had 10 children before she died around 1811. Here's the part that should stop you. In the 1990s, writer Edward Ball, a descendant of that same Ball planter family, was digging through old plantation ledgers for a book about his own family's history with slavery. He found something almost nobody finds: an unbroken paper trail of ship sail records, the captain's actual dispatches, and account books listing births across generations. He traced Priscilla's living descendants all the way to a woman named Tomalin Martin Polite, a speech therapist living in Charleston, 7 generations later. In 2005, with the help of historian Joseph Opala, who had spent 17 years researching Bunce Island, Tomalin traveled to Sierra Leone as a guest of the government. 249 years after her ancestor walked through the door of that slave fortress, in the same family line, she walked back through it. It's one of the only documented cases in American history where a black family can trace an unbroken line, ship date and all, back to one specific person, on one specific voyage, from one specific village. It's an incredible story. It's also, and this is the important part, almost certainly not representative of where most Gullah-Geechee ancestors actually came from. Here's where the science comes in. In 2021, geneticists published the most detailed genetic study ever done on the Gullah-Geechee, comparing whole genome data against African Americans from Mississippi, against actual Sierra Leonean populations, and against reference panels from across Africa and Europe. The findings confirmed something real. The Gullah show a slightly higher genetic relationship to Sierra Leone than other African Americans in the southeast. The isolation of the sea islands is genetically visible. Gullah-Geechee populations carry a higher percentage of African ancestry overall, and lower European ancestry than other African American communities in the same region, a direct genetic fingerprint of centuries spent cut off from the mainland. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. That same research and the underlying historical shipping records show that the Sierra Leone connection, real as it is, was never the majority story. Detailed records of the actual voyages into the Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry show that less than 4% of documented arrivals came specifically from Sierra Leone, the single largest origin region by a massive margin, accounting for close to half of all documented arrivals, was West Central Africa, the Kingdom of Kongo, and the Angola region. Some individual Charleston port records show Angola alone supplying nearly 40% of everyone who arrived there, actually outnumbering Sierra Leone. So why does almost nobody know the Angola story, while everyone has heard of Sierra Leone? Because Sierra Leone left a paper trail, and Angola for a long time mostly didn't. There's a castle you can walk through, ship manifests you can read, a family you can interview, The truth is, the Gullah-Geechee people are not descended from one African nation. Their DNA tells the story of an amalgamation built from Senegambia, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and especially Central Africa, all fusing together on a handful of isolated American islands. The popular narrative survived because it was the easiest one to document, not because it was the biggest one. That Central African ancestry isn't just a number on a chart. It shaped actual American history in a way most people have never connected to the Gullah-Geechee at all. In September of 1739, the largest slave rebellion in colonial American history broke out about 20 miles from Charleston along a river called the Stono. A group of about 20 enslaved men, led by a man recorded only as Jemmy, broke into a store, armed themselves, and marched south towards Spanish Florida, where Spain had offered freedom to anyone who escaped British colonies. They killed roughly 24 colonists before being caught and defeated by the local militia. For a long time, the rebels were simply described in records as Angolan. Historians have since pieced together something more specific. These men were very likely soldiers from the Kingdom of Kongo, a Central African kingdom that had been Catholic and Portuguese-speaking for almost 2 centuries, with standing armies trained in muskets and volley tactics. Some of the people enslaved on Carolina's rice plantations weren't just farmers. Some were trained, combat-experienced soldiers, which is exactly why the Stono Rebellion was so violent, so organized, and so terrifying to the colony. Afterward, South Carolina passed laws restricting enslaved people, and planters began avoiding further purchases from Angola, shifting instead toward the rice coast, including Sierra Leone. The dominance of the Sierra Leone story in Gullah-Geechee identity may be, in part, a side effect of a rebellion led by Central African soldiers. The version everyone remembers exists partly because the other version frightened slaveholders into changing their buying habits. Now let's talk about what actually survived. While the exact origin points get blurred and contested, the cultural survival itself is not in dispute, and it is staggering. In the 1930s, a linguist named Lorenzo Dow Turner, the first professionally trained African-American linguist in the country, began traveling to remote Gullah communities with a 100-pound recording device, at a time when most academics dismissed Gullah speech as broken English or worse, baby talk. Turner spent nearly 20 years documenting what he actually heard. His landmark 1949 book identified almost 4,000 words and names of direct African origin still in active daily use, traced to roughly 40 different African languages: Mende, Wolof, Mandinka, Temne, Congo, Yoruba, Twi, and more. This wasn't broken English. It was a fully functioning Creole language, carrying real, traceable African grammar and vocabulary, hiding in plain sight. Mistaken for poor speech by people who simply weren't listening closely. One of Turner's discoveries is especially striking. The Gullah Ring Shout, a counterclockwise circle dance combined with call and response singing, hand clapping, and a stick beaten on the floor, is considered the oldest surviving African-American performance tradition in North America. Older than blues, older than jazz, older than gospel as we know it. Turner argued the very word shout in this context may not come from English at all, but from the Arabic word shout, meaning ritual movement around a sacred object, which points to something almost nobody associates with Gullah culture: enslaved Muslims. That connection is not speculation. On Sapelo Island, Georgia, an enslaved man named Bilali Muhammad, a literate Arabic-speaking Fula Muslim, originally from what is now Guinea, became head plantation manager over hundreds of enslaved people. During the War of 1812, his enslaver trusted him enough to arm Bilali and roughly 80 fellow Muslim men to defend the island against a British attack. Bilali later wrote a 13-page manuscript in Arabic on Islamic law, believed to be the first surviving Islamic legal text written on American soil, making him, by most accounts, the first Muslim American scholar. His granddaughters, interviewed decades later, still remembered their grandparents praying on beads at set times of day, generations after the family had outwardly converted to Christianity. One of Bilali's sons is even believed to have inspired the character Aaron in the original Uncle Remus stories, meaning one of America's most famous folktale traditions has a hidden root running back to an enslaved West African imam. Language wasn't the only thing that survived against impossible odds. Sometimes it was a single song. In 1933, Lorenzo Turner recorded an elderly Gullah woman named Amelia Dawley singing a short 5-line song in a language nobody around her could identify. She didn't know what the words meant. It had simply been passed down as a children's lullaby. Decades later, a Sierra Leonean student recognized the language as Mende, and researchers eventually traveled deep into rural Sierra Leone, playing the recording in village after village, hoping someone might recognize it. In a remote village called Senegambia, Angola, they found a woman named Bindu Jabati who knew an almost identical song. It turned out to be a centuries-old Mende funeral hymn, taught to Bindu by her own grandmother, who had once told her that one day family taken long ago would return, and that she would recognize them by this exact song. In 1997, Amelia's daughter, Mary Moran, then in her late 60s, travelled to that same village and met Bindu in person. The community performed the long-dormant funeral ceremony for the first time in nearly 80 years. An enslaved woman with almost nothing left to her name, her language, or her family had managed to smuggle an entire sacred ceremony across an ocean, disguised as a nursery rhyme. 2 centuries later, it worked exactly as her ancestors had hoped it would. The Gullah-Geechee didn't just preserve culture quietly in isolation, they actively shaped the outcome of the Civil War. In June of 1863, Harriet Tubman organized and guided a Union raid up South Carolina's Combahee River that freed more than 750 enslaved people in a single night, the largest emancipation event of its kind during the entire war, and the only major US military operation in history planned and led by a woman. Tubman could not have pulled it off alone. She relied entirely on a network of Gullah boatmen and freedom seekers who knew exactly where Confederate mines were hidden in the river and which channels were safe. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions. When chaos broke out on the riverbank, with hundreds of terrified people scrambling toward the gunboats, Harriet Tubman, the most famous figure in the entire history of the Underground Railroad, could not understand the language being spoken by the very people she was rescuing. She did not speak Gullah. To calm the crowd, she climbed onto the deck and sang a familiar northern abolitionist song instead, because it was the only way she had to communicate at all. Gullah was different enough, distinct enough, African enough, that even Harriet Tubman needed something other than words to get through. This culture didn't survive purely by accident. It was actively, deliberately defended, and that fight is still going on right now. On July 2nd in the year 2000, at Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, with United Nations observers present, the Gullah-Geechee people formally declared themselves a self-determining nation within the United States after a year-long internationally monitored election. A St. Helena Island native named Marquetta Goodwine was elected Queen Quet, the first official head of state for what's now called the Gullah-Geechee Nation, a role she still holds. A year earlier, she became the first Gullah-Geechee person to testify before the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva about the loss of Sea Island land to development and rising property taxes. It isn't a legally recognized sovereign nation, but it's a real governing structure that helped push Congress to establish the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor in 2006. And if you think this is distant history, it isn't. On October 19th, 2024, during the annual cultural festival on Sapelo Island, Georgia, home to Bilali Muhammad's own descendants, and one of the very last intact Gullah-Geechee communities left in America, the ferry dock's gangway, rated to hold over 300 people, catastrophically collapsed under roughly 40 people returning from the celebration. 7 people died. A ferry worker had reportedly warned officials the structure seemed unsafe months earlier. Lawsuits are still working through the courts. At the same time, the tiny remaining community there, fewer than 50 full-time residents, has spent years fighting county officials, who quietly changed zoning rules to more than double the maximum house size on the island. A move residents say would trigger gentrification and tax increases steep enough to push the last Gullah families off land their ancestors have held since emancipation. Officials even tried to block residents from voting on a referendum to repeal the change. It took until September of 2025 for Georgia's Supreme Court to unanimously rule that residents had the right to that vote at all. The fight over that land is still not finished. So when you put it all together, what does the actual DNA, the shipping records, and the lived history of the Gullah-Geechee tell us? Not the simple, single origin story most of us were handed. Something far more complicated. A people forged, not from one African nation, but from dozens of them, fused together on a handful of isolated, malaria-prone islands, who held on to more African language, religion, and memory than almost anywhere else in this country, who quietly helped win a war, who declared themselves a nation when no one else would protect them, and who, right now, are still fighting, island by island, vote by vote, to keep what's left of that history from being paved over. The Gullah-Geechee were never just one story. They were never just Sierra Leone. And they were never just enslaved people who happened to keep some old traditions. They are one of the most genetically, linguistically, and culturally documented African diasporic communities anywhere in the Americas, and most of America still doesn't know their real story. Now you do.